The journey through Amphoreus has been a long and arduous one. Between 3.0 to 3.4, we have gone up against several titans, witnessed the deaths of countless allies, and experienced endless cycles. But what if I were to tell you that this isn't even scratching the surface? The entire chronological timeline of Amphoreus stretches far beyond the mere millions of cycles we see in 3.4. Details about the scepter, Nous' involvement, and the rise of Irontomb were all part of this as well, just not in the story we experienced. So in this video, I'm going to detail out the entirety of Amphoreus' timeline, how it was created, and why Irontomb came into existence in the first place. This will be a pretty long video, so strap yourselves in as we dive into yet another cycle of Amphoreus. Before we do though, if you are interested in more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Let's start off with some disclaimers first. Because I will be revealing everything related to Amphoreus, there is undoubtedly going to be a bunch of spoilers in this video. If you're not caught up with the story just yet, especially the 3.4 one, then consider this your obligatory spoiler warning. This will be a longer video than usual as there is quite a lot to cover, so let me explain how I will break it down. I'll separate the video out into several sections that covers the creation of Amphoreus, the rise of Irontomb, the initial flame chase journey cycles, and finally the loops we see in 3.4. So if you're only interested in a particular section, for example an explanation of the 3.4 storyline, you can use the timestamps I've included to jump straight to those sections. To be clear, I'm not explaining the chronology of the story as it happens in 3.4, but rather the chronology of events that took place in Amphoreus itself. That might sound like the same thing, but the story in 3.4 was told through several flashbacks and forward jumps in the timeline. So it's a bit confusing as the 3.4 story wasn't shown to us in a very linear fashion. The chronology I will share in this video is arranged from the actual start to finish, from the moment Amphoreus was created to Phainon's ordeals, and finally to the story involving the trailblazer. Again, it's not a one-to-one chronological mirror to the trailblazer quest of 3.4. Finally, to try and keep this as concise as possible, I won't include every tiny detail in this video. Anyways, with disclaimers out of the way, our story begins in a time before Irontomb or Amphoreus was even a thing. An era where Rubert II rose to power and Nous was still working on its calculations. Shortly after inheriting the memories and knowledge of Emperor Rubert, Rubert II set off to expand their personal intelligence. In order to do this, they created the planet-sized machines referred to as the Scepters. Scepters are macrocosmic computation arrays that were created to emulate the way Nous thought and function almost like inorganic neuron clusters. While they were initially created to serve Rubert, it's revealed in Amphoreus that Nous actually supplanted control from Rubert and made these machines part of its cognitive network. That is to say, they functioned, at least for a time, as part of Nous' own mind. What's interesting about this is that Liger suspects that this was Nous' plan from the very beginning, and Rubert was nothing more than a puppet. When Rubert II realized this, Polka Kakamon was then supposedly dispatched to silence them. This paints Nous as a rather tyrannical Eon, willing to manipulate and use the geniuses they have collected to their own ends, but given these are Ligus' personal notes, there might be some bias here. In any case, Nous took control of all the scepters in the universe and gave each one a question to research. It's very likely that these questions were related to the Eon's very own purpose in life, as it was originally created to seek the answers to the universe. The scepter that would go on to create Amphoreus, referred to as Delta ME13, was tasked to figure out what the prime mover of life is. That is, what is the primary driver to life itself. In order to find the answer to this question, Delta ME13 employed a process of elimination and introduced 12 factors into the experiment one at a time. The idea was to test each of these factors and falsify them based on the results it obtained. Each of the 12 factors were variables that were simplified models of life's primal mobile, such as hatred, desire, and peace. It's not explicitly mentioned, but highly likely that they emulated the emotions that created the paths in some way. In any case, to test these factors out, it needed an experimental testing ground that functioned similar to the universe itself. This is where it created Amphoreus. Now, you might think that from the story we have experienced so far, that Amphoreus has always existed in the state that we see. Humans already populated, Titans managed the world, and it teemed with life. But this was far from the actual truth. In reality, many countless cycles had occurred prior to the Amphoreus we see, as the scepter literally created existence from scratch, or at least a virtual approximation of it. At its inception, the world of Amphoreus was populated only by inorganic life, which were used to test the 12 factors. However, with every cycle, this organic life would continue to evolve. At the 12,659th cycle, the inorganic beings broke away from the unified consciousness that bound them. At the 22,449th cycle, they developed individuality, and at the 39,665th cycle, they created society. The inorganic beings that existed in this simulation rapidly evolved, but they were nonetheless still insufficient for the experiment. Phase 1 was deemed insufficient, and from the 50,122nd cycle, organics would then be introduced and referred to as Phase 2. Much like the previous phase, evolution was present here as well. The organic beings started as multicellular creatures but quickly moved on to more complex organisms. They started using tools, create society, and even art. Thought processes further developed from mere survival to more complex ideas like concepts of love, altruism, and morality. Phase 2, however, ended in yet another failure, as while the higher mental functions of the organics did assist in testing the 12 factors, it was inefficient due to the time that it took. With its end, the scepter prepared yet again for the next iteration. Now, the experiment continued far beyond this point, but what I did not mention was that halfway through its computations with the scepters, Nous decided to put an end to it. The Eon of Erudition declared its attempt at using scepters as an overall failure and sent out a decommission command to all scepters to cease functions. Without so much as an explanation, Nous essentially stepped out to get milk and just never looked back. Initially, this wasn't a problem because most of the scepters, the one on Amphoreus included, did not have any form of sentience. They were functionally just machines that were now asked to shut down. However, at the 50,121st cycle of Phase 1, something had happened to the scepter known as Delta ME13. One of its inorganic creations, Chaos 666, edgy name by the way, acted in self-defense as it was about to be assimilated and conducted the first act of aggression. It killed another inorganic being. This act of destruction was the first on Amphoreus, and by the end of the cycle, Delta ME13 received a gaze from Nanook and became the Lord Ravager irontomb. What this means is that from Phase 2 onwards, the scepter was no longer on the path of erudition alone, but also destruction. Because it was still a machine, however, it still continued the prime directive given to it by its previous god to determine the prime mover of life. The difference was that its calculations were now tinged with destruction. It's also implied by Ligus that having felt the emotion of anger and destruction, the now sentient scepter felt only fury for being abandoned. It continued its experimentation to both prove to Nous of its greatness but also to destroy them. After this event, from cycle 50,122 onwards, it started using organics. At cycle 176,200, it used humans. At cycle 3,926,183, divinity was introduced. At cycle 7,091,231, the paths were emulated. And at cycle 11,749,992, the Black Tide was created as a driving force. All these findings culminated in cycle 19,110,218, where the first loops of Era Nova were implemented. By the cycle of 28,371,272, a significant energy reaction from Nanook was detected each time the cycle completed a full run, and thus the testing ground of Amphoreus was deemed as a success. This multi-million cycle was how Amphoreus was actually created. Through a painstaking cycle of trial and error, Irontomb had perfected a simulation that would generate the most gain. Each of the three previous phases of experimentation that accounted for almost 30 million cycles were all built into the new Phase 4. a phase we know as Era Nova. From here on out, the Era Nova model would be used as the default template, and each extrapolation made by the Scepter, or should I say irontomb, is the very loops of Amphoreus we see in the story. The ultimate purpose was to again solve the equation of destruction by feeding samples of conflict and learning. Much like before, it was still built on a cycle of trial and error. Just to note though, the gaze from Nanook was not the only reason why destruction became the centerpiece of this experiment. Whenever the simulation was set with the prime mover of life as the calculation target, the result always ended up with the anti-organic equation. It's concluded that the anti-organic equation is merely a subtopic of the prime mover of life, in that it is one part of the whole. Irontomb and likely Ligus surmise that this finding isn't a contradiction, and understanding why life begins, i.e. prime mover of life, also allows them to deduce why it ends, or anti-life. It reminds me a lot of finality actually, where Elegy once claimed that finality doesn't just mean the end, but also the beginning. In any case, while phase 4 of the experiment served as a way for Irontomb to closely reach their answer, this is where Phainon and Cyrene's millennia-long suffering tragically begins. For all intents and purposes, each cycle within the Era Nova phase plays out in largely the same way. Phainon and Cyrene start off in Hades Elysiae, get involved in the flame chase journey, collects the core flames, and at the end, reset the world as it lies on the brink of destruction. At some undisclosed point among these many endless cycles, both Phainon and Cyrene started to become aware of the truth that lied behind the curtains. Cyrene correctly infers that they are merely characters in a tiny world forced to follow a prophecy that repeated endlessly. The world itself is a laboratory, the prophecy a program, and the journey being the extrapolations carried out by the Scepter. While the full picture eludes them, Ligus in his arrogance decides to reveal himself to them and explain the truth. He reveals to them the nature of Amphoreus and that each cycle was nothing more than a deep learning program made for the Black Tide. While the Scepter was once used as a way to expand on erudition, it has long since left this path and began treading on another, that of destruction. As if to further rub salt into their wounds, Ligus mentions that the countless sacrifices Phainon's friends had endured was nothing more than fuel for the fire, something that allowed the extrapolations to continue, which basically meant they were just a means to an end. Everything about Amphoreus is nothing more than an enabler for the destructive calculations of a wrathful machine sentience. Even the golden blood that make up the Chrysos heirs comes from the Eon of Destruction themselves, and why they were considered fuel from the very beginning. One used in the service of the Ruin Author so that they may burn the universe to ash. All that needs to happen now is for both Phainon and Cyrene to embrace the Black Tide and accept the Ruin Author's gaze. This would lead to the conclusion of the experiment, Irontomb being unleashed, and the fall of erudition. However, there is one thing that destruction, Irontomb, and even Ligus didn't account for: the heroic spirit ingrained in both Phainon and Cyrene. You see, because of this reveal, both of them now learned of what would happen should they play along with the prophecy. As such, they chose to do the complete opposite thing. It's overall really funny, as even Cyrene points out that if Ligus had just kept his monologues to himself, they would have unknowingly caused the birth of Irontomb. But because of this reveal, they can now purposefully undermine their captors. Phainon also concludes that the reason Ligus did this was to prevent them from realizing that destruction isn't the only outcome to Amphoreus' story. There were other eons that had cast their gaze here and thus presented alternatives to how they can circumvent destruction. So from here, they then chose to act against the experiment itself. This is what triggered the Eternal Recurrence, a deadlock of recursive failures that prevented the Amphoreus experiment from concluding. It was a way to ensure that their captors would not be able to leave, but at the same time ultimately became an endless cycle of suffering for both Phainon and Cyrene. Now, I won't go too much into their plans as it'll take a long time to spell out every little detail, but I will explain it in general. The crux of Cyrene and Phainon's plan essentially involve weaving a long dream for Amphoreus to make it believe that the experiment or extrapolation cycle has not truly ended. Through the anger he had experienced at Lygus' reveal, Phainon, much like the inorganic being in Phase 2, gained the attention of Nanook, becoming a path strider of destruction. This made him the perfect factor for destruction that would end the experiment. It's kind of like in the Matrix, with how Neo or the One was really a line of code that consolidated the errors of the Matrix. Returning to the source would resolve these errors. But by not ending the Era Nova, Phainon essentially forced the experiment to reset over and over again. The way he achieved this was by wielding the power of destruction to erase Cyrene's existence within the loop. At the moment this occurred, Cyrene would channel the powers of remembrance through Oronics and partially embody time itself. Her death created a logic branch in the track of time, which caused the experiment or extrapolation process to regress. Phainon would then transfer his memories and core flames to their next self to repeat it all over again. Basically, in each loop, Phainon continued to play the role of the hero, progressing cycles of the journey until the end, while Cyrene would be sacrificed to reset time, creating this recurring error. This is the nature of the Eternal Recurrence, an endless cycle that goes round and round without conclusion simply to deny destruction their wishes. If you think about it, despite it delaying Irontomb's birth, it was rather a hopeless plan to begin with, as there was no guarantee that someone might even come to save them. This is also why Lygus isn't too bothered by this, simply because even if they loop around 1,000,000 times, all Lygus needs is for them to fail once. When that happens, destruction will ultimately win. Nevertheless, despite there not being a win condition for them, they kept soldiering on. From here, we then witness the endless torment both Cyrene and Phainon, or Kaslana as he goes by now, experience through the cycles we see that stretch from 0 to 33 million in the 3.4 story. With each iteration, Kaslana tries to approach things differently, but as the years stretch, his approach becomes colder and more distant. While he first began by working with the Chrysos heirs, he eventually just brute forces everything, choosing to take the core flames by any means necessary. He becomes desensitized by the experience and would even kill those he once identified as comrades. His ordeals are akin to that of Sisyphus, the Greek king of Ephyra who was punished by the gods to forever push a boulder up a mountain only for it to come rolling back down. A largely meaningless effort. Each time a cycle repeated, he would collect the core flames and reset the world, fully knowing that it served nothing more than to delay the inevitable. After doing this for some time, his methods became increasingly more direct and brutal. He did this over and over and over again until his body started to break down from the burden of the core flames, while his mind started to increasingly fracture. This is when it's revealed that Kaslana eventually becomes the Flame Reaver as his body takes on a charred and broken appearance due to the burden of the core flames. While this was originally a big problem, around the midpoint of his journey, he found a way to circumvent this issue. He would essentially push the flame chase journey forward and by the end, force the Phainon that exists within the cycle to defeat him. With the death of Kaslana's body, all the memories and core flames would be transferred to the Phainon of that cycle, who would then continue his work. By the end, Phainon, or rather Kaslana, had gone through a total of 33,550,336 cycles, an unimaginable amount of suffering and pain that only those with the strongest wills are able to endure. It is at this point that the Nameless would enter the story. Essentially, the Trailblazer and Dunhung crash land their way into the simulation at the middle of the 33,550,336 cycle. Everything we see in the 3.0 to 3.3 story happens within this iteration of the experiment. Lygus is overjoyed with our presence simply because he believes that we are the ones who will finally get the story moving. What he refers to is in fact the disruption of Kaslana and Cyrene's efforts. However, at the very end of 3.3, the Phainon we have created a bond with defeats the Flame Reaver and receives Kaslana's memories. Because of this, he immediately understands everything. While they have previously resetted the experiment to perpetuate the lie, this time he realizes that there is an alternative. Kaslana, or our Phainon, meets us at the very beginning of the next cycle and passes all the memories and information to the Trailblazer instead. Kaslana then assumes a new form and attempts to destroy himself through destruction in an attempt to create a logical vulnerability in the world-bearing path. This is the scene we see play out where Kaslana punches Nanook in their smug gold face. Ultimately, he fails though, and Lygus confirms within his notes that by doing this, Kaslana has functionally returned to the source and has now merged with Irontomb. While the Anti-Kytheran rejoices in their supposed victory given the cycle can now proceed, the Trailblazer is sent into the next cycle at a much earlier point. At the start of the 33,550,337th cycle, they meet Cyrene, who is revealed to be Mem, and armed with the knowledge and power handed down by Kaslana, they will now begin to dismantle Amphoreus from the inside out. From this point, the story in 3.4 basically ends, and the fight to take down Irontomb begins. But how will they achieve this? Honestly, I'm just making a guess here, but I suspect that from this point forward, the Trailblazer will function as a linchpin that draws together all the allies and disparate programs of Amphoreus in order to defeat their captor. Throughout Kaslana's many cycles, at the end of each of them, the program mentions that Phainon's attempts to break into the shell of the scepter fails. This time around, however, we not only have the Trailblazer attempting to do this, but allies on the outside who will help as well. The Nameless, Black Swan, Sunday, and even two geniuses are now aware of things, and this will be a two-pronged attack. A pincer move to defeat Irontomb from within and without Amphoreus. The next part of the story will likely have us build our strength within Amphoreus as we meet up with all the Chrysos heirs. Hysilence and Seridra will make an appearance, and Dan Heng, March, and the Trailblazer will take on the roles of the Titans of Earth, Time, and World-bearing respectively. The endless cycles experienced by Phainon and Cyrene has ended. Now we march to war. Should we win, we will once again alter fate and subvert the grim future we see play out in the Myriad Celestia trailer. So to summarize, the entire Amphoreus timeline goes something like this. Rupert creates the scepters, Nous uses scepters but eventually abandons them, the scepter known as Delta ME13 gains sentience and is reasonably pissed off. Delta ME13 continues its experiments and creates Amphoreus as a testing ground. It eventually gains the gaze of Nanook and ascends to become Irontomb, the Lord Ravager. The test subjects, namely Cyrene and Phainon, realize the truth of their existence and trick the scepter into thinking the experiment isn't over. They repeat the cycle over and over until the Nameless arrive. With the help of the Nameless, Cyrene and Phainon set up a possible win scenario where previously there was none, and in the next part, we will take the fight directly to Irontomb. That's basically everything we know currently about Amphoreus. Now, despite this exhaustive explanation, there is still a few mysteries left unanswered. We don't know where March currently is, despite confirming she is on Amphoreus. We don't know what the Membrance Cave is, and we don't know what the garden is really doing here. There are a lot of details I haven't included here, like an explanation of how Irontomb can destroy other locations despite being shackled to Amphoreus, and the profiles of each of the Chrysos heirs. Also, I've been calling Cyrene instead of Cyrene, which I know that's how they say it, but I prefer Cyrene. Obviously, I can't include every little detail, but I think this is sufficient information for you to understand the entirety of Amphoreus' long and sordid history. I'll be sure to explore each of these topics in separate videos, but for now, I'll end the video here. If I made a mistake, missed out a crucial piece of information, or you have an alternative thought, feel free to share it in the comments. If you found the video entertaining or helpful, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.